Welcome to Readers of the Lost Art with your presenter, Dr. Paul Anthony Taylor, a recovering academic. And the title of today's talk is Homer's Odyssey Explained, Part 1, Introduction. He was their servant, some say he was blind, who moved among their faces and their things. Their feelings gathered in him like a wind and sang. They cried, "It is a god that sings." W. H. Auden, Sonnets from China. Thus the story of the Odyssey can be stated briefly. A certain man is absent from home for many years. He is jealously watched by Poseidon and left desolate. Meanwhile, his home is in a wretched plight. Suitors are wasting his substance and plotting against his son. At length, tempest-tossed, he himself arrives. He makes certain persons acquainted with him. He attacks the suitors with his own hand, and is himself preserved while he destroys them. This is the essence of the plot. The rest is episode. Aristotle, Poetics. Well, hi everybody, and this is what we'll be looking at, not the film, because as you'll see from the thumbnail, text before movie is the new military motto that I'm trying to introduce and make go viral. Fat chance of that. But I just was interested in the visuals of the forthcoming Chris Nolan Odyssey, and before that ever appears in July, I had the bold, ambitious idea to do all 24 books of the Odyssey, an individual video for each book. But also, I'm going to differentiate between what I'm going to call parts. So this is part 1, which is the background information and some context on the Odyssey. And then the next video will be book 1, and obviously there'll be individual videos for each book. But interspersed, just to break things up a bit, I will probably use part 2, for example, will be another more thematic, more general video in amongst the individual books that I'll be looking at, textually quite closely. So, and what I plan to do by way of a publishing schedule, let's see if it works, but what I'm aiming for is the first one will come out on a Sunday, the next one will be a Wednesday, then a Sunday, and just keep that going. A bit of an homage to the dactyl hexameter type rhythm that Homer himself used. And this, I came across, there's obviously various film posters to publicise the forthcoming Christopher Nolan film, but this is one of the more dramatic ones. And it just shows you how my mind works. But I immediately thought back to, and this will only be for people of a certain age in the UK, but there was this very famous Guinness advert, good before the Tinternet, and this was "Good things come to those who wait," which you could also think of as a motto for Odysseus, because he did wait 20 years before he got back home. But like I say, it was just the horse. That's how simple-minded I can be with visual images. Horse, Odysseus, horse, Guinness. But more seriously, one of the reasons I wanted to do Odysseus, the whole lot of it, was my dream, and possibly your nightmare, is for me to look at, in future, James Joyce's Ulysses. This is the nuclear threat at the back of all this. And there was a schema that Joyce gave to a friend, Gilbert, who was going to do a public talk. So we gave him this schema. And this is just a very limited version to give you a sense. So the Telemachia is Telemachus, the son of Odysseus. The first 4 books of the actual Odyssey itself are all about him. And then there are various parts you could divvy up. And there are 24 books in the Odyssey. In Ulysses, there are 18 episodes, and they match with corresponding parts of the day. So the 10 years of Odysseus coming back is condensed into one day in Dublin in Ulysses. So that's how it's all in Ulysses uses, James Joyce in Ulysses uses this backdrop, this influence of the Odyssey. And it strikes me that if you ever wanted to read Ulysses, without knowing. Well, the more you know about the Odyssey, obviously, I think the more helpful it would be for you to get the most out of Ulysses. So, God knows, well, it's going to be at least 24, but there's going to be a lot of videos on the Odyssey. And then, like I say, at some point in the future, if we're all still alive, I'd like to do a detailed read of Ulysses, and everyone who's survived and kept going on the channel will have this background in the Odyssey that they could tackle Ulysses with. Oh, Nostos, by the way, is Homecoming. So these are just the three. This is the most basic schema of Ulysses. It's much more detailed, the schema that James Joyce gave Gilbert. Right, so this is the new motto, text before movie. I think maybe we should do some military hand arm movement, but it is just, it's going to be obviously a blockbuster movie. Obviously all the film posters are very dramatic, and this motto I'm choosing, text before movie, describes literally looking at the text before the movie appears, but also more metaphorically and figuratively the idea that in my cynical worldview, the text should always come before a movie. The text is more important. But as we go along, there'll be plenty of guessing. I think do the ancient Romans call it horoscopy or something like that, about looking in animal entrails. There'll be lots of discussions and debates about what Nolan is going to do in his film. And we've discussed on the live stream slightly that I am quite dubious that he'll be able to make it work in terms of being an accurate representation of the Odyssey itself. It may work as a blockbuster movie. And one of the things I wanted to talk about all the way through as we go through the Odyssey are the implications of trying to adapt something. To what extent is an epic by Homer unadaptable in a modern format? And what's so special about it? And you may disagree, but I think there's strong arguments to say, and I'm going to look at them today. There are unique aspects about Homer's writing, about the culture that's condensed within Homer's work, and it's quite alarming in a way. Some people may say it's quite neutral, so what does it matter if someone's turning the Odyssey into a film? I do think it is a symptom of broader social trends of illiteracy, whereby everybody has to see things rather than read them. And if I'm honest, I really wish he wasn't doing this movie, but we'll see. And it's a fascinating, the actual Odyssey itself, I view as a fascinating piece of work, because we'll get into the etymology, but the concept of the Odyssey as a journey, again, I've used this phrase literal versus metaphorical just then, but literally he is traveling, he is on a voyage, an arduous voyage, but more metaphorically, he's finding who he is when he meets various challenges. And then the whole point of the big Odyssey is to return home to Ithaca, and that is metaphorical for finding himself. He returns home to his original hearth, and I would suggest that is partly, despite all the challenges he finds, does he really change? It's not just discovering new parts of the world, it's also discovering parts of himself. And just one of the things that always lies in the background for me is, to what extent does Odysseus change? To what extent is he basically the same person, or despite all these very dramatic experiences he has? And that made me think why it's such an important piece. I'll get into, it's one of the founding texts of Western literary culture, obviously. But for me, one of its most poignant, the right word, but one of its most resonant aspects is the way it represents, no matter what you encounter in life, no matter what challenges you try to meet, and you use various ruses and techniques or tactics, like Odysseus does, to battle all life's challenges. And despite all the times we might want to change and do promise ourselves we'll be different in future, like the January resolution that everyone makes, and people say I'll go to the gym, and it lasts about 4 days. By January the 5th, no one's going to the gym anymore, and they've spent a year's membership. But it's this wanting to change, and what you tend to find in life is that your character is your character, and that aspect of the Odyssey interests me. So there's this concept, but then there's also in that period, Heraclitus, the pre-Socratic Greek philosopher, there are various Greek philosophers who had a notion of flux and flow and life. One of Heraclitus's students, I think Heraclitus had the idea you can never step in the same river twice. Oh, I think one of his students said not even once, the idea being that life, like a river, is constantly flowing. So there's what the Odyssey really portrays is to what extent are we the same person, and to what extent do we change over time. And I've looked at philosophy of mind and modern conceptions of subjectivity recently, and that is one of the perennial issues in mind, philosophy of mind, in neuroscience. To what extent is subjectivity a constant? To what extent is it in constant flux? So that's an aspect that's in Greek philosophy. And then there's various aspects of Odysseus. He's a trickster. And when you actually get into the text, it's ambiguous as to whether he's an admirable or, quite dodgy character at times, because I know dodgy is not exactly a classical literary term, but he's very manipulative, very cunning, very sly. And this feeds into, in lots of different mythologies, not just Greek, there is the notion of the trickster. So I think in Native American mythology, you have the coyote. There's various trickster gods or spirits. And Odysseus was famous for this, and I think there's a Greek legend whereby he tried to avoid conscription. So if you compare him with Achilles from the Iliad, which I'll be doing in a second, Achilles is this embodiment of glory and honor and seeking to prove himself in battle, and Odysseus is the exact opposite. And there's this legend whereby he was trying to avoid conscription. One of the scouts went to check to see whether he was. He was a bit like Hamlet. He was adopting an antic disposition. He was acting a bit mad. And he yoked, I think the legend is he yoked an ass and an ox together and tried to plough his field. And he also sowed his field with salt, which would obviously destroy its fertility, to try and portray himself as unfit for service, for military service. And the scout, his son was in the field, his young, very young son. So his son, I think he put his son near the plough so that Odysseus had to avoid his son. And that's when the scout argued, well, you can't be mad. You didn't mow down your son with the plough. So all of this stuff's going on. Odysseus is this encapsulation of the cunning, sly spirit. And one of the parts, as a verse to the books, that one of the part videos I'll be looking at will be the Dialectic of Enlightenment by Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer, who use the Odyssey as a very specific. They do a very specific study. They use it as an exemplum of how Western culture prizes cunning and rationality in a particular way, and they trace its origin or one of its first depictions to the Odyssey. So that's one. There are just a few of the themes I'm throwing out, and these are the books for this particular talk, I'll be drawing upon. So Daniel Mendelsohn did recently I think it's probably the most recent translation of the Odyssey, and I'll be talking about the whole complexity of the different translations, their different strengths and weaknesses. But the book here, An Odyssey, a father, a son, and an epic, he actually splices, he does an analysis of the text of the Odyssey, but he also has, it's all about his relationship with his father. He goes on a cruise with him that, it's one of these themed cruises that tries to go the same route that Odysseus did. His father's very elderly at this point, and it's all about the poignancy of you become the father becomes the child, but how we relate to our parents. So all of that's going on. And to be honest, if you're just looking for an accessible, well-written, bit of an autobiography and lots about the Odyssey. It's a very good read. I described in a live stream recently. I think I've had a empathyectomy. It's a bit hokey for me. It's a bit. There is, I think, in a North America. I don't mean to pick on Americans, but there is a bit of a North American open your heart out type of thing, whereas I'm from the type of that used to be a British perspective of stiff upper lip, never emote, never show your emotions, keep it all in a ball tight within you. And, you know, if you go gaga later in life, that's fine. But don't bother anyone. Whereas this is very emotive and pour your heart out on your sleeve and oh, daddy. And it's all very emotional. But if that's what interests you, the bits, at least half of it, is very well written about the Odyssey. So I'm not doing a very good sale of this, but it's well worth reading just for the Odyssey bits. But if you also want that, a bit of light relief at times, you get that as well. Homeric Moments by Eva Bran. I keep tempting to say Eva Braun, but I've got to stop doing that. Eva Bran. That would be a completely different book. She wrote, I've read a few of her books. I think, I'm trying to remember in my very dodgy memory. I think she did something on Heraclitus, but she did something on Plato's Republic. So she's written about Plato. And this particular book about Homeric Moments I really liked. And I'll be quoting from that. And then finally, Homer, the Poetry of the Past. That is all about the nature of what epic is. So I'm going to just skate through various bits of all three books. But Andrew Ford's book interested me because it's a modern academic treatment of what actually was epic poetry. How did the Greeks themselves see it? And what he, plot spoiler, he basically says that epic poetry is about a very unique, particular relationship to the past. And that interests me because I would argue in our current culture, through cancel culture, through increasing illiteracy, through quite a number of things, we're not in touch with the past. And I think one of the most powerful aspects of the Odyssey is the way in which, once you do make the effort to read it, it gives you all, it almost transports you directly to a whole different world deep in the past. So we'll explore that. I think Andrew Ford's book really deals with that really well. So this is the actual beginning of the Fagles translation. Like I said, we'll talk more about translation and its peculiarities and peccadillos, but that's a whole other, you could spend, hours and hours talking about translations. But this is the beginning of the Fagles translation. So sing to me of the man muse, the man of twists and turns, driven time and again off course. Once he had plundered the hallowed heights of Troy. Many cities of many saw and learned their minds. Many pains he suffered, heartsick on the open sea, fighting to save his life and bring his comrades home. But he could not save them from disaster, hard as he strove. The recklessness of their own ways destroyed them all. The blind fools. They devoured the cattle of the sun, and the sun god blotted out the day of their return. Launch out on his story, muse, daughter of Zeus. Start from where you will. Sing for our time too. Now this is called the proem. This is like the synopsis at the beginning. And I'm going to use the Fagles translation just because I've looked through a pile of different translations and it's a completely subjective choice. But I think it's one of the more engaging. Some of the translations are from all the reading I've done, because I have no original ancient Greek. You have to bear that in mind. It's my complete ignorance in that area. But from all the consensus of opinion, and I find the most useful reviews are those that explain why, from a personal point of view, they prefer a particular translation. And the Fagles, the consensus seems to be that it's quite energetic, it's quite entertaining and accessible, whilst being, without taking too many liberties with the text. The Mandelson is maybe a halfway house, because something like the Emily Wilson translation is a very new one as well. And that has very mixed responses. It's quite polarizing. Some people really don't like it and think she's taken too many liberties. I think in his preface, Daniel Mandelson critiques, he doesn't like the Emily Wilson translation. My advice, to cut to the chase, is try and have a look at as many different translations as you can. There's even Samuel Butler, the English writer, wrote a prose version, which it's different, let's put it that way, but it's worth looking at just to get a sense of perspective, all the different approaches that can be made. But anyway, with reference, I'm only going to look at a couple of slides dealing with the actual text specifically today. And in the next video, it will be book one. I'll go through it, every single line of book one. But just to throw out some ideas from the get-go, sing to me. I'm going to be talking about that in a moment. The concept of singing. The poet, the reader of the poet, the professional reader. In Greek, they referred to it as singing. They didn't just read out a poem. They weren't literally singing with, melody. But there's an element of, it was called singing, and I'll get into why that was. They don't, it's what interesting, it says, sing to me of the man, but they don't mention who specifically he is. And I'll in a second contrast that with the beginning of the Iliad, where there's specific names and details given. So Achilles is mentioned immediately in the first line, whereas this is just the man, and then the man of twists and turns. And then at the very end there, sing for our time too, which is interesting because that is why I like the Odyssey, because of its relevance to our days. And that's in the Fagles translation. But just to if you can, like I say, I will probably in future do a more systematic comparison of the different translations, but to be honest, it just take you forever because it's just endless subjective choices. But this is the Lattimore translation, which by all accounts is it's one of the most accurate in terms of translation from the Greek. But then the question is, does he keep the rhythm and the engagement going? So Lattimore would have been a very good choice as well. So he says, tell me rather than sing, and I'm going to argue that that's significant. Tell me rather than sing to me. The man of many ways, it's another way of saying of twists and turns. Arguably, again, this is where the subjectivity gets in. I think I prefer the twists and turns versus the man of many ways. What else just to pick out? It's similar, but do you notice the bit where sing for our time too at the end there? Speak and begin our story. So our story does have an association with our times, but I do think sing for our time too is a much more direct call for topicality, or it's an emphasis upon how what's to be told is relevant to remember the events of the Odyssey that Homer or whichever reader of this poem was proclaiming to the audience took place. There's lots of guesstimates, but they think Homer was roughly 700 BC. And the events could have been as far off as 1100 BC that he was describing. Like I say, that time scale is hotly debated. They don't really know, to be honest. So even in those times when he's saying sing for our time too, there's a, possibly 4-century gap. So whoever's proclaiming the poem, they're emphasizing right at the beginning of how relevant it is for current events. And now we have, more than 2,500 years later, the debate is it still relevant? And my argument that I'll be developing over the weeks is, yes, it is still relevant, but ironically, with portrayals such as Christopher Nolan's movie and how it will likely turn out, I've mentioned this in a live stream, I honestly, personally think it would be better that the movie's never made, for the likelihood that people will engage with the textual version of the Odyssey. I think people will get the misguided sense they know or they've had access to the Odyssey just because they've seen the IMAX film. And actually, no, you've had a boulderized version. But I'll moan about that at a future date. So speak and begin our story. Now, I would just out of interest, I wanted to show you the beginning of the Iliad by way of comparison because that starts completely differently. And I love the fact, is it meinin is the word for rage in Greek. And that's the first word of the Iliad, rage, which is basically me watching football. So I really chuffed to see that that's how the book starts. It's very clear what the book is about. And in one word, because the whole of the Iliad is basically about spoiled men acting like children and being violent, to put it in a nutshell. But you see, I said it, Peleus' son Achilles, that he's mentioned rather than just sing about the man. Again, the word sing, but it's about a very specific person. And then towards the bottom, begin muse when it actually tells the muse the divine inspiration were specifically to begin the story. Whereas in this, you can see from some point, here, goddess, daughter of Zeus, speak and begin our story. It's very clear from, and if you go to the previous one, start from where you will, sing for our time too. So start from where you will, from some point, and then begin muse when. This last one is very specific as to when to begin. The other one is the other two translations about the Odyssey are very much less clear. And that's interesting. And I'll explain why shortly, because I'm going to suggest that that's interesting, that the lack of clarity of where to begin is actually a representation of being lost at sea in a certain way. And the book is very clever with those type of correlations you can make between what's being said, how it's being said, and what it's representing. So Odysseus being lost and wandering, the introduction to the Odyssey is quite wandering as well, and not very clear in some ways. So menace, there's different formations of the word rage. I think that it begins menin in the actual, but generally menis is rage. This is the disadvantage. I don't know any ancient Greek. I'm hoping I can make up for it by making other links to modern social trends and other forms of literature. But if you want, I just want to be open. I'm not a classical scholar, never have been, so you'll have to bear with me. But what interests me is the concept of menis, rage, divine or profound wrath. You've got thumos, which is passionate rage, the different types of rage, orge, lingering rage or vengeance, lyssa, fury or rabies. And then you could probably have something like Paul loss when he watches Liverpool lose. That would be a particularly vehement form of rage. But then you think about the Greek words for love. There's agape, which is, who was there's an American writer, William Gaddis, I think it was, wrote an actual short book called Agape. But it's unconditional. It's often used in religion. You give yourself over to God completely. So it's a very, it's like divine love. Eros, which everyone knows about. Well, not everyone, but you know what I mean. It's people should be familiar with the concept. Quickly moving on. Philia, friendship. Storge is familial. Pragma is enduring friendship, and then ludus, playful. So, why I'm showing you all these different types of phrases, all for the same basic concepts, either rage or love, is that one of the beauties of ancient Greek and ancient Latin is the complexity, of some of the ideas that they had. Just one word can have all these different meanings. Whereas, think of the English equivalent, I love you. That's it. It's very limited. It's German, ich liebe dich, which doesn't sound very romantic. Te amo. There's all these different things, but as far as I'm aware, most modern languages don't have this level of complexity. So we think we're more sophisticated, we think we are more technologically advanced, but linguistically, there's a strong argument to say what you can find in things like the Odyssey is a whole other level of depth and complexity. So I mentioned this idea of being lost at sea, figuratively and literally. So this links to the idea of identity of the proem. That's not a typo. The idea of the opening salvo, the synopsis at the beginning. So this is Mendelssohn from An Odyssey. Proem's a man immediately followed by the specific act of devouring the cattle of the sun prefigures the issue of identity. Who is this man? His slow, and this is one of the things about the whole story. The first 4 books are all the telemachy. Telemachus is the sun, so telemachy is the books that deal with the sun. I think it's only book 5 that you actually begin to meet Odysseus. So the first few books, it's setting the scene of what's happening in his household. And then the whole of the story is a very slow revealing of Odysseus coming back. First he sees his son, then the Euryclea is an old female servant. I think it's book 19. There's a very symbolic moment where she recognizes a scar on his thigh that he was hunting when he was very young, and he got gored by a boar. And it's a beautiful moment, which I'll talk about later. Then he meets his wife, and then finally, very poignantly, he meets his father, who's very elderly by this point. So it's the whole epic is about, we don't know at the very, very beginning who this man is, and he is finding his way back home, which is arguably metaphorical for finding himself. And it's all about the loyalty. His wife, Penelope, has been loyal for 20 years. It's complicated in the sense that Odysseus himself, has he been loyal? He gets a bit handsy with various figures like Calypso, the nymph, very accurately described as a nymph. So there's lots of complexity going on. There's this thing I mentioned about the scar. The scar is mentioned, the discovery, and then there's a huge, what you might call an associative spiral. There's a huge detour where Homer describes how he got the scar. And that's one of the aspects of the Odyssey. This idea of being lost at sea. The narrative encourages that feeling of disorientation because it's constantly circling and going nowhere and coming back. And the whole, the unifying theme of the whole tale is finding your way home through various digressions. Remember the description of Odysseus at the beginning, a man of many twists and turns. So that describes both him as an identity as a person, but also the literal path he's taking is twisting and turning. And I think in the Proust book club that we're doing, it's in Combray, the beginning of Combray Part 2, and he's at his Aunt Leonie's, and there's a description where, I seem to remember it's about, in my edition, about 34 pages, where Proust goes off on a digression and then returns to Marcel being at his Aunt Leonie's home. And there's that element because a major aspect of the Odyssey is about time, memory, finding your way back, and remembrance of things past or in search of lost time. There are parallels. It's this associative spiral technique of the narrative. And I think it's what puts a lot of people off Proust, But actually, the nature of an epic tale is that you have to sit back. There aren't any car chases. You have to sit back and let it wash over you. And I honestly think that's the best way to enjoy Proust. It's this same let it all wash over you. The epic novel, In Search of Lost Time, is going to take so long, you might as well just lie back and enjoy the ride. And that's what I mentioned earlier about the time, this not knowing, start from where you will. And Mendelssohn points out this is hamathen in Greek, so from some point in time or another. It's very vague, the beginning. So just to continue with Mendelssohn's words, this strangely tentative careering between concrete specifics and unhelpful generalities gives you a familiar feeling, the feeling of what it's like to be lost. Sometimes it's as if you're on familiar territory, sometimes you feel at sea, adrift in a featureless liquid void with no landmarks in sight. In this way, the opening of this poem about being lost and finding a way home precisely replicates the surf-like oscillations between drifting and purposefulness that characterize its hero's journey. So I'm sorry to bang on about it, but it's just that right from the get-go, the very structure of the poem in the form of the proem, the beginning, is it encapsulates what's going to happen in the poem proper. And that is an aspect of, you can see it in, I'm trying to think of other examples, but Ovid's Metamorphoses, there is this circularity and this rhythm, the tales. I think one description I've read is reading Ovid's Metamorphoses is like watching a snake eat its own tail. The Ouroboros, I think it's called, the idea of the symbol of a snake eating its own tail. So just to give you, the whole point of this particular talk is to give a sense of the richness of the language. So just a little etymological detour. Polytropos, the of many turns, that's the Greek word used to describe Odysseus as a man of many turns. And I've mentioned these, it describes him figurative, there's a cunning person, but also he's wandering in reality or in the fictional story. So it's a very rich, brilliant epithet, of how to think of Odysseus. And Mendelssohn's of many turns also refers to the shape of the hero's motion through space. He is the man who gets where he's going by travelling in circles. In more than one of his adventures, he leaves a place only to return to it, sometimes inadvertently. And then, of course, there's the biggest circle of all, the one that brings him back to Ithaca, the place he left so long ago, that when he finally comes home, he and his loved ones are unrecognisable to one another. And then, to carry on with this exploration of etymology, Mendelssohn gives some interesting ideas here. So voyage from the Old French, and in the Latin viaticum are provisions for a journey, and also you have the root via for road. So there are various ways of describing a journey or a voyage, or what we'll come to see is referred to as an Odyssey. So the journey, Old French journée, origins in the Latin diurnum, which means the portion from a day, from dies. So the idea was, how far can you travel in a day? And remember, journeys in ancient times would have taken day after day after day. A bit like travelling on a British train system. Talking of travel and travail, an instrument of torture, that should be the advertising logo for the national network in Britain. So, tropalium, instrument of torture. It's a great notion of because I do not like traveling more than most people. I really do not like it. I'm not scared of planes or anything at all. It's just the actual act of having to travel. I do think it's torturous. And I must think, apologies for any women who've had children, because they say there's almost some biological thing whereby women forget the pain of childbirth, which is the only reason they can have any other children. There's some psychological process whereby your body just makes you forget the horror of having given birth. And I think that's why people keep going on holiday, because they just psychologically forget how horrible the process of being stuck in endless airports was, and they deludedly go off and do it another time. Not for me. But joking apart, the Odyssey, Adune, pain. So Odysseus, in the etymological sense in Greek, is man of pain. So I think Mandelson makes the point that a Greek listener to the epic would have that connotation. And this is one of the sad things, that you have to really work to get all these connotations because of the generational loss, the layers, the sedimentation, the archaeological language, that you have to dig down like an archaeologist to get some of the full connotations that are going on. So just to return to the beginning, sing to me of the man muse, the man of twists and turns, driven time and again off course, because I want to show you the second part that's arguably another slight proem. So sing to me of the man muse, the man of twists and turns, driven time and again off course, once he had plundered the hallowed heights of Troy. Many cities and many saw and learned their minds, many pains he suffered, heart sick on the open sea, fighting to save his life and bring his comrades home. But he could not save them from disaster, hard as he strove. The recklessness of their own ways destroyed them all. The blind fools, they devoured the cattle of the sun, and the sun god blotted out the day of their return. Launch out on your story, muse, daughter of Zeus. Start from where you will. Sing for our time too. I'm tempted to say lunch out on his story, but that would be an example of a modern adaptation, which is basically what Christopher Nolan's going to be doing, if you ask me. So that's just to repeat. I've gone through it again because I wanted to show you the next. It's unusual. The Iliad isn't like this, but this is almost a second proem, or it's a continuation of the proem beyond that first section, which is the proem proper. And I think Mandelson argues that this is again indicative of being lost at sea, because there's a wandering in the proem beyond its normal bounds. So by now all the survivors who've avoided headlong death were safe at home, escaped the wars and waves, but one man alone, his heart set on his wife and his return. Calypso, the bewitching nymph, the lustrous goddess, held him back, deep in her arching caverns, craving him for a husband. But then, when the wheeling seasons brought the year around, that year spun out by the gods, when he should reach his home, Ithaca, though not even there would he be free of trials, even among his loved ones. Then every god took pity, all except Poseidon. He raged on, seething against the great Odysseus, till he reached his native land. I think if without being, ragingly narcissistic, if I was a Greek god, I think I'd choose Poseidon, because I'm constantly angry. But it's another day, maybe one of the parts I do in the midst of all the books that we're looking at. So one of the part videos, it might be interesting to look at the specific gods mentioned, because Poseidon is a key figure in the myth of the Minotaur. And if you're thinking of the Mediterranean, the constant earthquakes they'd have, and the sea would come up like tsunami-like. So it's a characterization of the natural forces that we're not immune to. You think what happened in Japan a few years back, and in periodic tsunamis around the world. But obviously for ancient people it was probably even more destructive. So moving on to Eva Bran, not Eva Braun. So Eva or Eva Bran. I think that Homer's alleged blind. I'm interested in this concept of stasis that I'm going to oppose to Hollywood. I think that Homer's alleged blindness betokens the extraordinary visual acuity of his poetry, the sharply detailed inner visions he constructs for us in words. Such sights of the imagination tend toward a kind of vivid momentariness, a pregnant momentousness. Much later, Aristotle will bring into use a word very familiar to us in its modern adaptations, energeia, often translated activity. For us, energy is the capacity for being actively at work, but energeia is the fulfillment itself of that capacity, expressed not in locomotion, but as of a kind of vibrant stasis, where any being is fully at work, just being itself, being what it was meant to be. And this is like quite important stuff. This is the type of thing Heidegger, in his philosophy about being and time, Sein, being, he was fixated about being, whereas most modern analytical philosophy or most science is about understanding life as objects that you fit in measurable boxes, or the way that Bran is describing, we translate energeia, energy, as in science it's a unit of measurement of power. But this idea of activity, particularly in Hollywood, its unit of wattage almost, its power, its amperage is activity. It's the constant movement of its films. But one of the things I wanted to emphasize by using this Bran notion is that it sounds like a complete oxymoron, vibrant stasis. But there's an energy of being in the Odyssey that I see as an antidote to modern stress. It's a different pace. It's a different immersion in the experience of the poem that you don't get from modern media-based forms of entertainment. So into the dynamic, temporally flowing narrative of the epics are set those stations of activity. When the tale comes to its fulfillment in a high point, a moment of summary significance. These moments are often primarily visual, in the sense that the words set the scene, and we are responsible for turning their indications and intimations into the picture that shows the meaning. For example, Homer leads us into the scene where Penelope and Odysseus, faithful wife and returning husband, sit face to face in private over their own hearth for the first time in 20 years. And I've also mentioned the scar, the old female servant recognizing the scar. These are images that are, paradoxically, we achieve those images in our head from the words that are spoken or read. And this paradox is what absolutely intrigues me, because where she says, Eva Brand says, these moments are often primarily visual in the sense that the words set the scene. No matter how good Christopher Nolan's film is going to be, these moments are often primarily visual, is going to be translated into the all-singing, noisy, IMAX, technologically immersive experience. What Brand's describing here is much more subtle. It's the mental images we create. And on another occasion, I want to look at Roland Barthes. He wrote this brilliant book, Camera Lucida, that I can see being able to tie it into various themes going on now. But in Camera Lucida, which is a book, it's like quite an autobiographical, because he mentions pictures of his mother and people. But it's a reflection upon the nature of photography, quite a personal reflection. But he uses these terms, punctum versus studium. And the idea is that the studium is the overall mode of understanding a picture. So if you're looking at a painting, you understand the historical context. If you're looking at a photograph, you tend to know what it's the scene that's being depicted. But the punctum is what Roland Barthes says is the individual aspect that can be quite arbitrary and random, that appears to you and affects you. And arguably with paintings and art that isn't photographic, the artist is using all their skill to evoke a response from you. And the form and the content and the technique, they're all joined in this brilliantly artistic ensemble. Whereas Bart's point about things like photographs are a random arbitrary feature can jump out at you. So, to put it in other terms, I can imagine watching a Hollywood film, and I think, what's called in psychology, I have lots of psychological issues, but weak central cohesion is one. So I can watch a TV program and I'll think that it always happens that coffee cup's empty. They're pretending it's full and it isn't. The suitcases are always empty. And I'll spot, things that are wrong, continuity errors. You don't really, that doesn't really happen in good art because there's much less room for arbitrary accidental things. But the arbitrariness, the punctum of in Christopher Nolan's film, just looking at Matt Damon in whatever role he's going to be and thinking, well, that's not how I envisaged Odysseus. And also, what she's talking about, Eva Bran, here is these moments in which words set the scene. But you don't actually have, this is the paradox, you don't actually have a visual image strongly in your head. It's a very subtle, vague, it's vivid. It's this simultaneously vivid image when you're reading something profound, but also visually, it's not detailed at all. So when I'm reading a book and thinking of a protagonist, for example, off the top of my head, Crime and Punishment, Raskolnikov, I don't think, I think of his personality. I can almost imagine him in the streets of St. Petersburg, but I don't, was it St. Petersburg or Moscow? I think it was St. Petersburg. But I don't have a very strong idea of who he would be as an actor, and I don't want to. That's the beauty. The minute it's put into visual form, I think, ironically, you lose something. So the manner and mode of their mutual acknowledgement remains unsaid by them or by Homer, but it is nonetheless shown, for it is a remarkable fact and one of the ultimate mysteries of human nature, that words spoken over many passages can converge to concreteness in an internal picture that carries conviction, which I was babbling about trying to put it in words like that. But just to repeat, that internal picture that carries conviction doesn't carry great visual information. And yet, it's incredibly powerful. And she goes on to say, and of course, there are many such moments when time stops and something becomes manifest, which are purely verbal, when we are meant to hear an arresting, even heart-stopping word sound. For example, when Achilles mourns his dearest friend, Patroclus, whom he has sent into battle as his surrogate, he cries out, I have lost him. But the Greek word for lost can also be heard thus, I have destroyed him. And as in one of those optical illusions where a figure suddenly shifts meaning, the Iliad suddenly admits a more flickering, sombre light. And I've emboldened that phrase, a more flickering, sombre light, is the exact opposite to what you'll get in the IMAX theatre. Bran is pointing out that in the original Greek, whether it's the Iliad or the Odyssey, the ambiguity, the subtlety, the nuance, that I've given you examples of the etymological nuances, they're baked in. It's from the very beginning of the proem in the Odyssey, there's ambiguity. Cinema struggles to do ambiguity. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's just much more difficult. And ironically, in a recent live stream, we discussed Memento, a Christopher Nolan film that actually does ambiguity. But that was before he got given the huge budget and he had to justify his existence within Hollywood. But this is an example of one of those moments. This is from the Iliad. And like a poppy, he let fall his head to one side, a poppy that is in a garden, laden with fruit in the showers of spring. So he bowed to one side, his head made heavy with helmet. And that is stunningly beautiful because I deliberately didn't give you the full context. It's Gorguthion is a young minor character, and someone's fired an arrow that's meant for Hector, Priam's son, and it misses and hits this young boy or this young warrior, Gorguthion. And this is how he dies. And like a poppy, he let his head fall. He let fall his head to one side, a poppy that is in a garden, laden with fruit in the showers of spring. So he bowed to one side, his head made heavy with helmet. Now, I'd argue you don't get a strong mental image, but you get a strong emotional impact ironically, from the very fact the effect of this writing isn't displaced or overcome by visual detail. Whereas if you saw this filmed, there would be so much specific detail. I just don't think it could have the same. It would have an emotional effect, but not quite the way this works. Just that phrase, so he bowed to one side, his head made heavy with helmet. I think that almost in one couplet just describes it's not, doesn't even describe it. It's a manifestation in practical terms of what poetry does that no other art form can do. To say his head made heavy with helmet, it's just a uniquely poetic description that is a photograph or a film can be correct. And Heidegger made this distinction between what's correct. It's technically correct, but I'd argue this written or this verbal description, his head made heavy with helmet, is actually more true, despite the fact it's a lot less detailed than a full, all singing, all dancing HD image. I'll get myself all worked out now. Whoever needs a plot driving straight to a denouement will not be able to tolerate epic, which requires not so much a patient as a laid-back listener. The ample telling of the tale, that Homeric time-taking, not only affects the reader, but the people of the epic. And I just make again the corresponding reference to Proust. I mentioned earlier, it's what sets Proust apart. The very thing that's a barrier to most people, just the length of the book, is actually what makes it so special, because it's so anti clickbait culture that we live in today. And then what she does is interesting. Eva Brand then distinguishes between tragic and epic heroes. So tragic heroes tend to undergo sudden catastrophic shifts of fortune. So Othello, Hamlet, Macbeth, etc. Their fate which leaves them transformed but also dead. Odysseus at least undergoes a multitude of experiences, vicissitudes that leave him more like himself than ever and very much alive. And arguably that's what makes Odysseus. The Iliad's great, but it's not as interesting or as subtle as the Odyssey. And my point I made earlier about Odysseus that leave him more like himself than ever. To what extent can you actually escape your own character? You always end up returning back to who you are, despite whatever the life coaches tell you. As Homer of infinite variety is the first poet for us, so single-minded Parmenides is the first philosopher, the first enunciator of the one and only being that is the chief preoccupation of philosophy. He is in almost every way the intended opposite of Odysseus. Like Odysseus's return, Parmenides' way is guided by female divinities, but there the two diverge. So just to explain, in the 5th century BC, Parmenides wrote a poem, it's known as On Nature, and there are two parts, divided into two basic parts. One's called The Way of Truth and one's called The Way of Opinion. And it's written as a poem, and he describes how he's guided by these sun maidens, Heliades, I think they're called, through this celestial gate, what's called the House of Night, and that's where the goddesses teach him the way of truth versus the way of opinion. So the way of truth for Parmenides, he uses a poem, a bit like Plato uses dramatic or literary methods to engage in philosophy. Parmenides distinguishes between the way of truth, which he means the one truth, the objectivity of science, and the way of opinion. And this is arguably where Western culture, you could suggest this is where it all went wrong, because the pre-Socratic philosophers, the Homeric epics, had this notion of nuance and complexity, and the way of truth and the way of opinion weren't separate, that they're inextricably linked. The problem, arguably, I keep saying arguably, I need to stop. The problem maybe is the idea that you can't, we in a technological scientific society are always seeking the one whole indivisible truth. But what the Odyssey does brilliantly is show you the complexity, the cunning, and so on that's needed just to survive. The moral, complex decisions he has to make, the compromises he has to make. It's much more accurate to a lived life than Parmenides believing there is one truth. While Odysseus, a mature man of many thoughts and many stories, meanders home, collecting experience and material treasures on his way, Parmenides is a youth who takes a wild ride right into the heart and house of truth, where one thought overwhelms all multiplicity and ends all speech, and it is this unspeakable treasure, being, that he is bidden to take back with him. And I love this phrasing. It is the opposition between the poet's scintillating sensory particulars and the philosopher's illuminated intelligible oneness that these poems exemplify. Because I think we live in a current culture that's absolutely saturated with the illumination of intelligible oneness. Everything's excessively transparent. Whereas poetry, the Odyssey, evokes and portrays scintillating sensory particulars, and that's what makes it special. So, dull formulaic epithets that during the speaking of the poem, they tend to use various stock phrases that a reciter of the poem would have relied upon to make their recital easier. And some people see that as a bit repetitive and boring. So the example Bran gives is, the delegation arrives. So this is from the Iliad again. Achilles, surprised by their coming, jumps up, lyre in hand, to greet them. So doing, he is called swift-footed. Surely not for his gesture of amazement. The proponents of formulaic composition might cite this as a case of ineptitude, but in fact it is Homer at his most adept. Let me again call Aristotle to aid. He invented a term for that culminating completion in which a being is what it was meant to be, held in the timeless moment of its own fulfillment. Entelecheia. The usual translation is actuality. He distinguished a first and second such actuality. Feet may actually be swiftly moving, but this runner's actuality is only second to a primary one. Whether sitting, lyre in hand, or rising in greeting, Achilles is a swift-footed runner. It is his very nature to be swift, swift-footed and swift-fated, whatever he might actually be doing. So entelecheia, it's this wonderful notion. It goes back to this notion of vibrant stasis. Even when Achilles is doing nothing that would justify the claim that he's swift-footed, it is the characterization of him that absolutely sums him up, and it exists in whatever form of his life he's living. So the equivalent for me would be probably, it's an English word, mardy, would be my overwhelming entelecheia. The same with the storylines. Are they dull and formulaic? Homer, though he may well have inherited storylines, takes his departure from the people who spin their tale out of their natures. The scenes, settings, even the artifacts emanate from them. In the Odyssey, this description becomes spectacularly true when Odysseus becomes the weaver of a fairyland that is an externalization of his own soul. So I've recently been looking at Hamlet with reference to Christopher Nolan's Memento. And one of the things that made me think when I read this was this beautiful phrase that I've emboldened, an externalization of his own soul. That's what happens in Hamlet. And just like Homer can take, camera's moving, just as Homer can take quite stereotypical storylines and do something special with them, Shakespeare took the genre of tragedy and played with it. And it's what great artists do. They use the limitations of a genre and being circumscribed by the expectations of a genre, and they use that tension to achieve something even greater. So this idea that Odysseus becomes the weaver of a fairyland that is an externalization of his own soul, I think that equally applies to Hamlet. So within the confines of rigid storylines, within the confines of the tragedy genre, the second case would be Shakespeare. So Homer uses the epic genre and makes something more of it. Hamlet is part of the tragic genre, but is so much more than a tragedy. And then there's this argument about words have no life outside the text, which some scholars would say you need to just pay attention to the words themselves and not how they relate to an outside world. And interestingly, Derrida is one of these people who's blamed for all the evils of the world because he's classed as a postmodernist. There's this famous phrase he came out with, il n'y a pas de hors text. And it's always been interpreted as there's nothing outside the text, meaning everything is a game, everything is textual. And there's a brilliant Australian, he's English, but I think he's naturalised or he's living in Australia, Christopher Watkin. And he describes how hors text actually in French refers to what's known in English as a frontispiece. You know, there'll be a picture at the beginning of a book, an old-fashioned book, that summarises what goes on in the actual text. So his preferred interpretation is when Derrida said il n'y a pas de hors text, he's not saying there's nothing outside the text, all life is just a text. He's saying there's no frontispiece, there's no key to understanding the text that is life. We're just mired in it. And this is what happens with Odysseus. He's mired in life and the ordeal, the Odyssey that he has to engage in. So there's a fact specific to the epic against such a self-confining approach of reading words without their world. Homer himself thinks that he is telling the tales of a passion, the anger of Achilles, and of a man, the wanderer Odysseus, and that these come to him through the muse, who sings for him of the people and of the events known among the gods. Thence comes the fact that Alexander, in other words Alexander the Great, who wanted to reincarnate Achilles but lacked a Homeric muse, merely conquered the world for a moment, while his avatar Achilles captivated the ages. Hence I shall write of the epics as of a finite number of words, telling of an indefinitely large world. So I think she points out brilliantly here the paradox or the irony. She's saying that Alexander the Great wanted to be the living embodiment of Achilles, this amazing warrior. But actually, there is a relationship between literature, which seems so insubstantial and non-existent. Actually, the story of Achilles has lasted thousands of years, whereas Alexander controlled the world, or a large part of it, for a very short, I think, didn't he die when he was about 33? So his time on Earth was glorious but short. And yes, he survives in legend, but I can say arguably again, but perhaps not as much as Achilles, who's perhaps more famous down the ages, or if not more famous. I think it would be fair to say we have a much stronger sense of Achilles' character, and as a character, he's more well known than Alexander, who's by comparison a slightly flat historical figure, despite all his achievements. We might well read the Iliad without knowing the Odyssey, but to read the Odyssey without reference to the Iliad would be to read under a handicap. For one defining aspect of the second poem's protagonist, the tardy homecomer, is that he is the incarnate antithesis of the prematurely culminating young warrior. Where Achilles is short-lived, swift-fated and swift-footed, Odysseus will grow old, endure heavy vicissitudes, see his runner's legs go through wear and tear, tell me about it, and reach his great moment in late middle age. Achilles has one man as a bosom friend, while Odysseus is befriended by a series of women, young and not young, human and divine. Achilles is, in his own estimation, a man of truth, while Odysseus is a proudly accomplished liar. All in all, Achilles is a blazingly prodigious being, while Odysseus is just an interesting man, though perhaps the most interesting man ever to get into a poem. Patroclus was the best friend of Achilles, in case you're wondering. But perhaps the most interesting man ever to get into a poem. And again, the parallels with Hamlet. Hamlet's perhaps the most interesting man ever to get into a play. So I'll just finish off by looking at some of Andrew Ford's statements. And he goes out of his way. I mentioned earlier the concept of the coyote, the trickster spirit. You could think of Odysseus as the beginning of man's victory over divine memory, but from the get-go, epic poetry was all about divine memory. So epic thus resists rhetorical analysis, so about its, structural elements, the words used, and so on, by collapsing the form and content of heroic poems into a notion of past actions as the substance on which poetry offers us a transparent window. The poetry of the past is constituted as a genre whose laws and forms pretend to have been written by heroes on the indelible surface of divine memory. And I won't go into too much depth, but this idea, the transparent window and the indelible surface of divine memory, what perhaps we're allowed to do when you read something like the Odyssey is you're teleported back into this almost timelessness. You go back into 2,500 years ago and it feels immediate, even if you're not aware of all the peculiarities and specificities of life in ancient Greece. But you're almost put in touch in this weird way with divine memory. In a way, again, I cannot see a Hollywood blockbuster that's in touch with all the requirements of the Hollywood commercial sector. It's a completely different kettle of fish. The muses are less an archive than divinities presiding at a performance, a presentation of deeds as they happened and still happen under their divine purview. Yet would it be equally anachronistic to translate poetry into a purely aesthetic activity, seeing it, for example, as an artistic representation of painful deeds that makes them pleasurable through the imposition of order and meaning. In a mysterious way, the muses do make the experience of poetry so wholly persuasive and absorbing that it becomes an emotional transport. But this experience is less like aesthetic contemplation than like presence at a divine epiphany or a necromancy. So you may think this is overstating the case. He's not exactly holding back, is he? But there is something unique about reading Proust or reading Homer that is so ethereal. It's like Eva Brand was saying about the mental images that are conjured up without actually having any mental images. It's this weird ethereal aspect that I can't think of any other art form, certainly not cinema, could ever achieve. So just to continue with this notion of it's a form of magical enchanted immersion. Epic thus resists rhetorical analysis by collapsing the form and content of heroic poems into a notion of past actions as the substance on which poetry offers us a transparent window. Sorry, I said that, haven't I? Yeah, sorry, that's a repetition of a slide. 0 out of 10 for editing for me. Epic poetry, past melting into present. So I'm getting to the end now, you'll be glad to hear. But this relationship to the past, the divine epiphany, the relationship between the audience and the work of art is transformed into a relationship between the present and an invisible past evoked. Accordingly, questions we as critics may wish to raise about the poetry, how the poetry works, and what makes it unique, must be answered in psychological terms, such as memory and forgetting, combined with phenomenological ones, the seen and the unseen. By connecting itself with these ideas, Epic manages not only to efface poetry as a set of linguistic effects, but even to efface the importance of poetic performance as a confrontation between poet and audience, song and psyche, text and reader. So this will all be pursued in future weeks, but memory and forgetting, again, in search of lost time or remembrance of things past, it's also what Proust is doing. The seen and the unseen. The epic holds both in tension. The cinematic IMAX experience is completely based upon showing you as much of the seen as possible, and the unseen falls by the wayside. So just to finish with this notion of iode, iude. The traditional word for what a poet does, singing, iude. This is what was mentioned at the very beginning, just to bring everything full circle. Singing may seem so natural an expression for this art as to be hardly significant, but the etymology of iode, supported by a number of texts, leads me to explore its relation to a word for the human voice, ode. The trope of singing as voicing suggests tensions between reducing poetry to substance, the timbre and volume of the oral poet's voice as his instrument, and allowing it to dematerialize into meaning. Voice as an expression of thought. The epithet common to poets singing and voice, thespis, God spoken, will resume these and the other problems raised in the near contradiction of an art of a God-spoken human voicing. So there'll be plenty more discussion. I just wanted to bring it full circle. I started off talking about why I preferred the translation of sing to me rather than tell me, because of what Andrew Ford's saying here, that this concept of singing, to repeat, is not literal singing as we know it melodically today, but it's this weird form of literary expression that has this oxymoronic quality of being definitely human, but just touching the edges of the divine epiphany that was described earlier. So you have this apparent contradiction, a God-spoken human voicing. So thanks for being as patient. If you're still with me at the end here, um, we'll look at that God-spoken human voice in the next video, which will be book 1. And just to reiterate, the idea is occasionally I'll do videos like this, which are general, context providing, generically explanatory, but most videos will be book 1, book 2, book 3. There'll be an individual video for each book, and the idea is to do a close reading and go through the whole text, and hopefully I'll manage to get the balance right. So until the next time, all the very best. Take care.